Why, hello there. It's been a minute. This is the I Actually Read the Book podcast, and I'm your host, Spencer Regal. And today we'll be going over 3 books that have almost absolutely nothing to do with each other, except for the fact that they're relatively brief, and I read each of them over the course of the last couple months. And so, without further ado, let's dig in. So, first we have Tyrant, which is a book, it's subtitled Shakespeare on Politics by Stephen Greenblatt. And Stephen Greenblatt, if you don't follow Shakespearean scholarship, like some of us do, not including me, Stephen Greenblatt is one of the world's foremost authorities on Shakespeare. He's a professor at Harvard. He is the John Cogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard, and he's won a Pulitzer and a National Book Award. And also, if you notice, and we do have a change of scenery here from our last couple episodes, we have a bust of the Bard himself, and then over there we have the Norton Shakespeare, which is if you might remember, is the text we read from. It has the version of Measure for Measure that we read from when we quoted from it in the last episode, all those months ago. And then you might see, you probably don't because it's very hard to see on this camera. Stephen Greenblatt's name is underneath the Norton Shakespeare title because he is the general editor of the Norton Shakespeare, and then under him are other collaborators, other scholars that collaborated with him to produce the Norton Shakespeare, which is one of the most highly respected editions of Shakespeare on the market today. So Stephen Greenblatt is one of the world's foremost authorities on Shakespeare, so I was thrilled to see this offered in, I got it at Barnes & Noble. It's not very long. It's very readable. In fact, it's one of the most enjoyable books on Shakespeare that I've ever read. The thing about Shakespeare is that he is my favorite writer, by the way, so I take writing on Shakespeare very seriously, and whenever I think anybody's saying a bunch of nonsense about Shakespeare, I'm not happy about it. So I was very much impressed by Greenblatt's work, or by his writing style, his ability to distill ideas and to present them in an easily digestible and enjoyable manner. I thought it was compulsively readable. So, and that's something that we do concern ourselves with a lot on this podcast is readability. You might have guessed, I don't think I've ever said this, but explicitly on the podcast, but I am not a fan of abstruse and very difficult writing, not because I'm a dummy, I hope, but because I think that if you cannot express your ideas cogently and in words that are understandable by most human beings, or at least could be understood if, say, you had a dictionary nearby, then I think that you don't know what you're talking about and you're trying to impress people by using the words that you just garnered from your thesaurus 5 minutes ago, or your ideas don't actually have any substance and you're talking about airy-fairy abstractions that have no reality in the actual world. And I'd say a lot of people in the humanities practice such a con. They practice such a form of deceptive scholarship, of false scholarship, and one of the insidious effects of it is that it intimidates people who aren't part of the intellectual elite already. They intimidate these people into thinking that they can't actually understand high culture. They can't actually understand works like Shakespeare's plays because it's just too difficult for those stupid rubes to ever get their heads around it. And those people, the people who write those sorts of, that in this style, have largely political agendas of their own, but also class interests too. They do pertaining to this intellectual elite that doesn't interact with the riffraff who can't understand 3-page long sentences that have no verbs and a subject that's lost in the first couple clauses and things like that. Judith Butler. But anyway. So without further ado, let's dig into Tyrant. So Shakespeare, a lot of people don't really recognize this in the modern day, in the modern context, because of course it's sometimes difficult to completely bring Shakespeare into our modern political context, especially as most people don't have much acquaintance with Shakespeare, but that's beside the point. Shakespeare, as with other works of classic, as with other authors, and with his plays, with respect to other works of classic literature too, we often assume when we look at them in our own context that they're these rarefied, abstract, ideal works of literature, of artistic creation that almost have no bearing or have very indirect bearing on current political realities. And the thing is that Shakespeare was a very political writer. A lot of the things that he talked about, a lot of his plays have very political themes, have themes that were very relevant to his times. And because he was such a brilliant writer and such a universal thinker, such a playwright who is able to see beyond the confines of his own time to either forecasting things that would come in the future or going back to the past and applying and garnering universal wisdom from there. From you see his Roman plays, you see Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus. So Shakespeare, we must not forget, can be very politically relevant. Even though, for instance, we don't live under an absolute monarchy anymore. We don't live under a monarchy in America of any sort. We never have, at least since 1776. And so it sometimes can be the more direct, the more immediate political relevance of Shakespeare is sometimes left out, is sometimes it's not given its full appreciation. And Greenblatt, to his credit, does. Now, I will say that his attempts to do so do seem a little skewed in a certain direction. He is a Harvard professor, and Harvard is not known for rock-ribbed conservatism. And so we're going to see how, I will try to point out later how, in spite of his excellent writing, his excellent writing abilities, and his very profound understanding of Shakespeare, he does allow his partisan predilections to get in the way every now and then. So let's explore this more directly. The first insight that Greenblatt gives us, the general view, he explores the general tack that Shakespeare would take in exploring politics, and he describes this as taking oblique angles to political issues. That's the title of the first chapter. So what he essentially says, the concept of what Greenblatt means by an oblique angle is say you take a political event or a social event or phenomenon in general, and Shakespeare, firstly, in order to avoid censorship, in order to avoid angering the wrong people, he would look at the situation from an oblique angle, in a way. He would distance himself from his immediate social and political context, which, as I might say, is a virtue that is very much lacking in the humanities nowadays, but that's beside the point. So Shakespeare would look at an issue, at a dispute or a situation, a historical event, from an oblique angle, removing himself, for the moment, from his political context, and he would see what truths about human nature, about the human condition and political and social institutions could he gain from analyzing this situation? Excuse me. And from there, he would apply these truths. He would take the truths, and sometimes he would make directly parallel situations. He would either introduce anachronisms into say the Roman plays in the past, or slightly alter the historical material that he worked with in the history plays in order to make these cases more aligned with the dispute that took place in his own day. And so he could easily avoid the charge of having politically charged material, of showing it on the stage. And yet at the same time, to perceiving audience members, he would be able to convey maybe not necessarily his own political opinions. I think he didn't, that's a little too narrow and petty for him to have dealt with. But to show his general response to the situation at hand, and he would be able to convey that. And then, of course, for us, with 400, 500 years in the future, we can read into Shakespeare. We can garner the truth that he buried in the text, and in a way just left them there for us to discover, and for us to get what he was implying and what he might not have been able to say full-throatedly in his own time. And so Greenblatt doesn't take a view of politics, or doesn't, he doesn't look at Shakespeare's views of politics necessarily, everything. He doesn't go over everything that Shakespeare ever said about politics, which would go far beyond the scope of a book that's as short as this. Instead, he focuses on how Shakespeare depicts tyranny, and tyranny is perhaps the political subject on which Shakespeare spent the most time. and considered, because it was the most directly relevant in his own time. He lived under two different kings, or two different monarchs. He lived under Elizabeth and then later King James the First, I believe. And these issues over Parliament, over the role of Parliament and what legitimacy Parliament had, where its legitimacy, what were the bounds of its legitimacy, and its claims on the power of restricting the power of the monarch. These were very relevant concerns, and so tyranny is one extreme, sickness that a polity could have. That one extreme where you have an absolute ruler who is not bound by custom, by convention, by any constitutional restraints, and uses power for his own pleasure, and wreaks terrible harms upon the country and sometimes upon those closest to him in the process, and ultimately experiences a fall down. And so Shakespeare, as you would expect, spends a lot of time dissecting the character of Richard III as he progresses, and he starts in the Henry VI plays, goes on through Richard III, and then through the ending of Richard III. Unfortunately, he didn't, as I was hoping, he doesn't spend much time on Henry Bolingbroke, on who is in Richard II and later becomes Henry IV and goes on through the Henry IV plays. Because he's not exactly a tyrant per se, he doesn't rule tyrannically, but I think that's a very politically fraught play. It has a lot of political messages in it, which I think I dissected to some extent on the show, however inadequately, and I wish that I'd gotten more of his interpretation of Richard II in this book, but he only had so much to cover. He only had so much he could cover in this book, so. He spends, just to give a broad overview, since we have two other books to get to tonight, he does spend a lot of time dissecting Richard III. He also, the other tyrants that he discusses at length are Macbeth. He spends a chapter on Coriolanus, which is interesting because I had never really I had covered Coriolanus in a college class before, but I hadn't really read anything about Coriolanus. It's a neglected play. I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for. He spends some time on, as I said, on Richard III, and then he also explores the political intrigues that are depicted in the Henry VI plays before Richard, first the Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III comes on the scene. He spends time talking about the Duke of York, the duplicitous character in Henry VI Part 1 and 2. And he talks about Macbeth, he talks about Richard III, and of course he spends a lot of time dissecting Richard III's character, showing the roots of his tyrannical personality, the different excesses, the different abnormalities that constitute Richard's character, and which either lead him toward tyranny or a manifestation of his tyranny, or ways in which, rather, his tyranny manifests. And so I just want to make sure I cover make sure I mention everybody that he talks about. He does cover briefly the Roman plays, as I said, Coriolanus, but also he spends some time on Julius Caesar. And then he finishes out by talking about some of the Romance plays. He talks about The Winter's Tale, which is not a play that I had read, so it was interesting to get a first look at this, to get a summary of the plot in this chapter. And so I had read most of the plays that he talks about, but I hadn't read the Henry VI plays or The Winter's Tale. And just since I hadn't been exposed to those plays before, he summarizes them very well. And I think he does of course, since I haven't read them, I couldn't give my own opinion on it, but I think he seems to make very convincing cases for his opinions. And so, how do I say? What I'll do is I'll summarize the general points that he makes about tyrants, and then we'll get to the little, little infelicities, I would say, that one can find in this book, as in places where Greenblatt's own partisan predilections come in and kind of muck things up, at least for me, can make him seem can make his work seem a little motivated in it for less than, oh God, how do I express this? They call into question his ability to apply the judgment and the judgment and sagacity which he judges Shakespeare to the politics of our own day. And the thing is that he thinks that he's being subtle, like Shakespeare was in his plays, in the way that he criticized contemporary rulers in his plays, that he depicted events that were very analogous to events that took place in his own time. He thinks that he's engaging in a similar enterprise, and the thing is that that's laughable because he's not subtle at all. And I'm going to show you that why I'll show you quotes that it's pretty hard to interpret them as being anything but very thinly veiled snipes at the current president. And I want to make sure I marked out a quote that is just so, pardon me, bad phone. Sorry about that. And here we go. All right, I found it. And so the general traits of the tyrant that Greenblatt sketches out are ones that will be familiar to anybody who's studied Shakespeare's depiction of the tyrants, who's seen Richard III or Macbeth. First, drawing on Richard, he says that the tyrant is excessively petty, is very self-absorbed, and the self-absorption stems from insecurities that were instilled in him as a young man, as a boy. And the way that they manifest in the case of Richard is with his insecurity with respect to his physical appearance. That Richard III is deformed in the play, and so he was always treated as this monstrous, evil figure that, as he says, that dogs bark at as they halt by him. And so this, and the resulting fact that his mother, for instance, that Richard's mother never doted on him, never gave him the motherly affection he was always desiring. This led him to pursue that sort of affection and recognition through political and military exploits. And so that's the source of the ambition that leads him to commit the terrible things that he does later in the play to achieve power. There's a sexual dimension in all of Shakespeare's tyrants. In Macbeth, there's obviously the tension between him and Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth essentially goads Macbeth into committing the murder of Duncan because she questions his manhood, and she questions his sexual appeal, his ability to sexually master her, so to say. She puts him to the test. Says, are you man enough to do this when I command of you, or will I have the mettle to do it and thus put you to shame? And so there are sexual undertones to tyranny, and we see that also with the fact that tyrants often, when they and also with Richard, in that he seduces Lady Anne. He spends some time dissecting that scene in particular. That there's the insecurity often manifests in the sexual dimension. With Richard, it's wanting to overcome this physical deformity, this disadvantage that he has when it comes to his appearance, by being so crafty, by being so seductive in terms of his personality, and in terms of his facility with words. So the okay, I guess this is where we should get into how Greenblatt ties this into politics. So essentially, the tyrant is supposed to be Donald Trump. That's just without a question, and we can get that by just reading the acknowledgments, or the afterword. So in the acknowledgments, he says, "Not so very long ago, though it feels like a century has passed, I sat in a verdant garden in Sardinia and expressed my growing apprehensions about the possible outcome of an upcoming election. I wonder what election that could have been. My historian friend Bernard Justin asked me what I was doing about it. What can I do? I asked. You could write something, he said. And so I did. That was the germ of the current book. And then, after the election confirmed my worst fears, my wife Rami Targoff and son Harry, listening at the dinner table to my musings about Shakespeare's uncanny relevance to the political world in which we now find ourselves, urged me to pursue the subject. And so I have." And just as a case in point of how unsubtle his criticisms are, the criticisms that he puts in here are, I'll just read. So this is a description of a character from Henry VI, Part 2, named Jack Cade, who's a sort of a rabble-rouser figure. This is the description that he gives of Cade and the role that he plays in the play. And so what I'm going to do is first I'm going to read the excerpts themselves, and then I'm going to insert Trump for every time he says Cade. So, Cade himself, for all we know, may think that what he is so obviously making up as he goes along will actually come to pass. Drawing on an indifference to the truth, shamelessness, and hyper-inflated self-confidence, the loudmouth demagogue is entering a fantasy land. When I am king, as king I will be, and he invites his listeners to enter the same magical space with him. In that space, 2 and 2 do not have to equal 4, and the most recent assertion need not remember the contradictory assertion that was made a few seconds earlier. In ordinary times, when a public figure is caught in a lie, or simply reveals blatant ignorance of the truth, his standing is diminished. But these are not ordinary times. If a dispassionate bystander were to point out all of Cade's grotesque distortions, mistakes, and downright lies, the crowd's anger would light on the skeptic and not on Cade. Famously, it is at the end of one of Cade's speeches that someone in the crowd shouts, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." So now, let's insert Trump into this. Trump himself, for all we know, may think that what he is so obviously making up as he goes along will actually come to pass. Drawing on an indifference to the truth, shamelessness, and hyperinflated self-confidence, the loudmouth demagogue is entering a fantasy land. When I am president, as president I will be. And he invites his listeners to enter the same magical space with him. In that space, 2 and 2 do not have to equal 4, and the most recent assertion need not remember the contradictory assertion that was made a few seconds earlier. In ordinary times, when a public figure is caught in a lie, or simply reveals blatant ignorance of the truth, his standing is diminished. But these are not ordinary times. If a dispassionate bystander were to point out all of Trump's grotesque distortions, mistakes, and downright lies, the crowd's anger would light on the skeptic and not on Trump. Famously, it is at the end of one of Trump's speeches that someone in the crowd shouts, "Build the wall." Just kidding about that. So, as you can see, he's not exactly a Straussian in the subtlety with which he wants to insert the true meanings behind his work. He's not very subtle at all. And this was the sentence that I thought was the most egregious. It really showed to me that as intelligent and informed, as knowledgeable as a man can be, as a person can be, as a scholar can be on any subject, that does not prevent him from being a total idiot when it comes to politics. And so let's read this. It sounds like something that came out of a conspiratorial left-wing magazine. So this is referring to Coriolanus, when Coriolanus goes and he allies himself with the Volscians, the enemies of Rome, after Rome exiles him. The plot twist is worth dwelling upon. It is as if the leader of a political party long identified with hatred of Russia, forever saber-rattling and accusing the rival politicians of treason, should secretly make his way to Moscow and offer his services to the Kremlin. So, as you can tell, that's extremely overwrought and unsubtle. And so, I do recommend this book. It's fantastic when it stays on topic, when it doesn't try to get into politics. And just so that people know, this was written that passage was probably written in 2017 when the Mueller investigation had just started. Now it's February 2019, and the Mueller investigation still hasn't uncovered anything. And the notion that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians has largely been discredited. There are some, of course, some of the associates have been indicted. Of course, some people in the Trump campaign were engaging in nefarious behavior. But this notion, the idea that he's trying to imply here that Donald Trump went to Moscow to solicit the help of Vladimir Putin is just absurd. And so I think this will show us that the deleterious effect on scholarship that being surrounded in an entirely politically homogenous place, a place where you work, a place where you think, such as Harvard, unfortunately, is. That this sort of insipid commentary is what shows. It shows that, for instance, Greenblatt has to contend with people when it comes to actual Shakespeare scholarship. Greenblatt has to present his views, to articulate them persuasively, and to provide evidence. When it comes to politics, there is no such opposition that he has to deal with. He deals exclusively with people who are New York Times left liberals. And so that's why his political screeds, or well, I don't know, that might be a little uncharitable to characterize it as screed, but that's why his more overt political statements sound like they came out of a New York Times op-ed page. And so I do recommend this book, but be warned, there is some political sniping in here that is pretty insufferable. But anyway, on to the next book. So next we have another Harvard Scholars book, Steven Pinker. We have The Sense of Style. So the sense of Steven Pinker, although I disagree with him on some very important issues, the existence of God and the proper foundations of intellectual, the proper scope of intellectual pursuit, Steven Pinker is indisputably a fantastic writer, and fortunately, it would be quite a tragedy if he didn't otherwise. The Sense of Style, he follows his own advice. He wrecks his own read. So, The Sense of Style is Steven Pinker's answer both to grammar purists. He spends a lot of time in The Sense of Style poking at people who obsess over, you've met these people before, people who obsess over split infinitives. Essentially, I think he calls her Miss Thistlebottom. Miss Thistlebottom being the grammar school teacher that you had at a young age, who would whack your knuckles over with the ruler if you made a grammatical error. And so he goes after the Thistlebottoms quite a lot, and it's very entertaining to watch somebody who he sits on the usage council, on the usage panel. Oh God, I don't want to get this wrong. He sits on the usage panel for the New American Heritage Dictionary. I believe the American Heritage Dictionary. I think that's right. So he has an extensive knowledge of grammar and a very colorful vocabulary, varied vocabulary. Learned quite a few words from this book. But at the same time, he realizes, and he articulates this, he explicitly advocates for this type of writing style. The primary objective that he has with any piece that he writes is to make sure that you and I understand it. He is not one of these people who, as he gives examples of in the text, he's not one of these people that's obsessed with showing his intellectual prowess, the convoluted nature of the abstruse, intricate nature of his thoughts, and the way that he has memorized every entry in Roget's Thesaurus. He advocates for what he describes as classic style. Classic style being a form of prose. Now, he of course recognizes that there are other forms of writing too. The type of writing that he would consider his own advice to be most relevant for is nonfiction informative writing, such as you would have in this type of book, and to some extent for some prose fiction. He actually cites his wife, who's a novelist and philosopher, Rebecca Goldstein. He cites an excerpt from one of her novels as an example of lucid and compelling writing, even though it's a work of fiction. And so he does recognize that when it comes to, say, political oratory or poetry, poetic expression, musical expression, that his advice wouldn't really hold. And so, but within its parameters, which are fairly broad, especially considering most of what's published nowadays definitely would fall within the parameters of what he would consider the proper scope of classic style, what classic style should be applied to it. So classic style is essentially involves clear, precisely articulated terms. That the first thing you do is, whenever you have terms that aren't familiar, the first thing is that you try to not insert as much jargon as possible. That classic prose should be free of jargon and unnecessarily obscure terms. It should be it should take the form of a conversation. That's one image that he uses repeatedly, is that reading should be a conversation between the writer and the reader. And so if you're describing something in a very, you'd have to bring the same level of attention and understanding that you do to a conversation. When you're communicating with somebody, with an individual person, you pay attention to their level of education, to their acquaintance with their level of familiarity with whatever it is that you're talking about, and you phrase your words accordingly. You phrase the way that you express something, or the information that you convey, because again, you have so much information that you could convey about a potential subject. You have to narrow down what you're going to say. You should tailor it to your audience. And that seems like a fairly rudimentary piece of advice when it comes to writing and communication, but it's neglected very often. And he spends a very amusing chapter going over pieces of just god-awful writing from luminaries of our time, such as Judith Butler and other people who are known for their terrible, esoteric, and largely meaningless writing. The major maladies of language that he looks at are legalese, academies, bureaucraties, and is there one more? Those are the main ones. But anyway, he diagnoses the main problems that come up with unclear or complicated, confusing prose is that people first use jargon. People use jargon, use words that don't have don't have really much relevance outside of their fields. They indulge in professional narcissism. For instance, the example he uses is that in a psychology textbook that he was considering writing, he thought about first just giving the sort of say the intellectual history of his field of cognitive psychology. Then he realized, why would that appeal to anyone aside from someone like me, who shares my concerns, which is in the history of cognitive psychology. And so instead, that you need to consider the needs of your reader. Why is your reader coming to you and plopping down $15 for this book and investing hours of reading to gain something from your book? What is it that he or she is wanting to gain? And damn it, you should provide it. And so the thing is that his pieces of advice are very rudimentary. They seem obvious at first sight, but the thing is that, as he shows, so few people actually follow them. And so I would say his take on grammar is interesting too. He doesn't follow squarely into either. How would I say? He's definitely in the debate between so-called prescriptivists and descriptivists. He's definitely on the descriptivist side. But he would nevertheless say that there are definitely correct and incorrect usages of words and grammar, and instances of correct or incorrect grammar. And so I would say my favorite part of the book is where he goes through and he explains how he gives examples of how grammatical errors, how their grounding and which we'll go through how. I suppose I should explain the idea rather than just summarizing it briefly and inadequately and then going on to it. But my favorite part of in brief are the chapters of confusing, humorous, and ambiguous sentences and word usages, and then followed by the final chapter, which it's fairly long, but it's very useful, where he goes through incorrect usages of words and where they come from, or rather, what is the correct usage, what's the incorrect usage, and then the comment as to, how terrible is this usage of this word. For instance, he actually first goes through what purists, what thistlebottoms commonly say are grammatical mistakes or incorrect usages of words, and then he actually explains why he thinks that it's a perfectly valid use of a word. For instance, with decimate, the word decimate used to mean, it comes from Roman history, where the Romans, there was a punishment that when there was a division that that needed to be punished for, say, mutiny, something like that, what the commander would do was take a tenth of the division and punish them, either kill them. I believe they were killed, they were executed. And so decimate, of course, in our parlance, means to reduce to nothing. In essence, say if you take a number, reduce it to a decimal, to take 1 and reduce it to 0.01. It's dramatic, and you take away, instead of taking away a tenth of the soldiers in this centurion. Am I using that word right? Anyway, instead of taking a tenth, you're taking 99% of or plus of whatever it is that you have. It's much more destructive, much more dramatic. And so grammar purists, of course, will say, "Oh, the unwashed masses are using the word decimate incorrectly," and he does not spare his scorn for these, these pedants, these petty, stupid people who spend too much time reading antiquated books instead of actually doing constructive things. And that's the thing. I think that learning should be. You should read in part so that you can impart knowledge to other people, so you can impart wisdom to other people. And grammar purists typically don't have that kind of motive at heart. They're typically motivated by narcissism because they need to do whatever it takes to distinguish themselves from other people, from the rabble. Anyway, so one of the crucial insights that Pinker brings to this book is he gives a model for how thoughts, how ideas are first conveyed essentially conveyed into sentences, and then from there how you make sentences into paragraphs, and then have those paragraphs cohere into chapters, into books, and how, for instance, that you could have mistakes along any part of the way that will completely undermine what it is that you're trying to do. And so the model that he uses to describe this process is that of the web, the tree, and the string. And so here we have an example that he provides of, this is what would be one person's thought bubble, or the sort of library of knowledge about Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex. So we have Sophocles wrote play, looks about story, which Freud wrote about theory, about story. Freud looks like Tom Lehrer wrote song about theory, story, etc. And so, of course, if you're trying to convey the information that's in that web of thoughts to a person, that would be bewildering. There's no way that you could just convey that without giving it any sort of structure, without having to structure it into sentences and then into paragraphs, and having to structure it in a coherent way. And so from there, so we have the web there. That's the information. That's the knowledge that is supposed to be conveyed by the sentences. And so then that's the web. And so the tree and the string come in when we try to write the sentences. And so this especially plays into syntax. So to understand how syntax works, it helps to visualize the ordering of strings within strings, which strings would be strings of thought. So we would have strings here with how strings connect one part of the web to another. And so trees would be entire sentences, such as this right here. And so there, as I described earlier, there are a variety of errors that you can make along either way, or ways in which you can confuse one part of a string with another. And so he goes through different grammatical errors, common grammatical errors, such as, for instance, when people say, he cites one example from Bill Clinton's campaign, where he says, here we go. Presumably Bill Clinton, who uttered, so give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back. And that's really a pet peeve of mine whenever people use I. Say this, they'll say, do you want to go to the store with Stephen and I? When they use I, when me should be used, because it's been drilled into them that it's called hypercorrection. It is a phenomenon in language usage, where people have been taught a rule that they think is, it's just the same when people use whom incorrectly. That people think that it's more proper to use, say, and I instead of and me, because the base thing to do, the base thing that children, that uneducated people use, is they say, me and Stephen, me and Stephen are going to the store. And so they're corrected, their parents corrected them, their school teachers corrected them, so that they would say, Stephen and I will go to the store. But then people hypercorrect sentences like, would you like to go to the store with Stephen and I, with Stephen and me, and change it to I, even though that's if you said that, give I a chance, everyone would be able to tell that that's incorrect. And so, how I would describe Steven Pinker's attitude toward language is that it's very flexible. It's he does make room for as any sane linguist should, for innovations in language over time, for new meanings of words that develop, and meanings that change, and also for instance, one debate that he touches on that has aided me in my understanding of the English language is his discussion of the singular they. For a time, it was a pet peeve of mine when people, and it kind of still is, whenever people just do it blithely and pay no seeming regard to the conventions of English. When people use the word they to denote a single person. For instance, oh, I went to the doctor's office and they told me instead of he or she. Now, in most cases, say if you're talking about an individual person, I think you should use he or she just because why not? It's just lazy and improper to use they. But at the same time, especially in common speech nowadays, it's using the quote unquote genderless he, or the goodness, why can't I remember this? The generic he has become taboo. I think people became a little too they got a little too ginned up about the generic he back in the 80s and 90s. And I did for a time. Thomas Sowell argues against the people who were arguing that the generic he is a manifestation of patriarchal attitudes, and therefore needed to be supplanted by either you needed to write he or she whenever you were saying a painter and his or her brush, something like that you needed to insert his or her, or say s/he. All the alternatives are pretty cumbersome. I think he makes a good case for why it's a panic that really only appeals to intellectuals. But Steven Pinker presented a point that I hadn't really considered before in this debate, which is that he is not generic. It's incorrect to say that when you use his to denote just general humanity, to denote a generic person, it can become absurd in the wrong. You can illustrate why it's not sexless, it's not genderless when you put it in certain contexts. And so he uses the example of, oh yes, when one wakes up in the morning and shaves his beard or puts on his pantyhose, or when one puts on his makeup, those don't sit well with us. And you may say that that's gender stereotyping, but that's because you're silly. But anyway, I think he showed quite convincingly there that he and his cannot be used as neutral denoters of persons in a way, or as exactly, as gender neutral ways to communicate about people. And so he doesn't really, every piece of advice that he gives is usually, he usually brings up situations in which it might not apply. And so that's what makes him very useful, is that, for instance, when he talks about using the singular they, which he documents, goes back to Shakespeare, has a storied history in English prose and literary expression in general, that you should not do that in more formal publications, obviously. He says that a lot of times, for instance, with split infinitives, he shows that it's a complete superstition. That split infinitives, the idea that you shouldn't, for instance, the example that people use is Captain Kirk's line from Star Trek, that to boldly go where no one has gone before. That's technically incorrect according to grammar purists who have their heads up their posterior cavities, but essentially they think that it should be reconstructed as to go boldly where no one else has gone before, boldly to go where no one else has gone before, and none of those constructions is nearly as compelling as the original. To boldly go where no one else has gone before, and he shows he shows he brings up the history of how this arbitrary and artificial rule came to be, which it's interesting. It comes from a false. There were some attempts back in the 1800s, I believe, to construct English grammar around the rules of Latin grammar. And so in Latin, infinitives are just words. For instance, it's the same in Spanish, where you have, instead of to play, you have jugar, or instead of to eat, you have comer. And so that means that if you had an adverb, an adverbial phrase, if you have an adverb that's modifying the verb, the infinitive, there's no way you could put that in the middle of the word because it's a single word. The infinitive is a single word. And so there's no way you could say, for instance, com biener. That doesn't make sense. You couldn't insert bien into comer to make to eat well, except to have, say, to eat well, to well eat. That's weird, but that's beside the point. That's just an example. So that's where this arbitrary and stupid rule derived from, because it's plain that English grammar is not structured, has never been intended to be structured around the rules of Latin grammar. Latin's the fountain of all Romance languages, and English is a mixture of Romantic and Germanic language. And so there's no reason to think that we should be bound to observe the rules that bind Latin and especially in our everyday speech. But so even though he does recognize that rule is arbitrary, stupid, and often can lead to botched expressions of what would otherwise be nicely worded sentences, such as our example with Captain Kirk, he does say that because it's a popular superstition among people who read, among professors, for instance, that you would be wise, if you are publishing for a formal purpose, to still use, or if you're writing for a formal purpose, you should still unsplit your infinitives. And so that's what makes Pinker so helpful, is that he gives a thorough account of superstitions, in some cases legitimate rules of grammar, which there are some that I found myself using. For instance, innervate. The word innervate doesn't mean to innervate actually means to lose energy, to have lost, to have become weakened and fatigued. It's not innervating the way that we think of it. Innervating meaning exciting, meaning giving energy. That's actually the exact opposite of what it means. And so I learned a lot from this book, and so I give it my full-throated endorsement. I think that it's a fantastic book. He definitely applies what he says. He lives by his own words, and it's very enjoyable, easy read, and I learned a lot from it. And I think it's a very helpful look at grammar, and it's a refreshing contrast to what we often get from manuals, from style manuals, and from the grammar purists who scold us to no end for doing things that they don't approve of because they're oppressive Thistlebottom. They wanted to be Miss Thistlebottom's pet, teacher's pet back in grammar school. So on to the last book. So we have Major Dudes, a Steely Dan Companion. I told you these books had absolutely nothing to do with one another. So, something that's interesting since we last met, I have become a devotee of Steely Dan. I wasn't really into them last time I did a podcast, which was 6 months ago. God, I think it was even more than that. It was coming up on 7 months ago, end of July, and this is mid-February. And so, Major Dudes, the title is, of course, a reference to the song on Pretzel Logic, Any Major Dude Will Tell You, which is a fantastic song. Much better than Ricky, Don't Lose That Number. But don't tell anyone I said that. Anyway, so Major Dudes, it's not really a book per se. I mean, it is a book, of course, but it's not, for instance, you can't really say that Barney Hoskyns is the author. It's a compilation of articles, is what I'm trying to say. It's a compilation of articles, reviews, entries into magazines that were published throughout their career, both stemming from the 70s, almost 50 years ago, if you can believe that, from the early 70s to the present day. And it ends with the unfortunate recent passing of Walter Becker, who was... it's interesting. I knew quite a bit about Steely Dan before I read this book, but this book really, one criticism I have of it is that because these are different authors, and often, and each of these magazine articles is trying to convey to its readers the basic story of Steely Dan, that basic story will be drilled into your head 10,000 times if you read this book. So the beginning, they were New York kids. They went to they met at Bard College, which is this small liberal arts college in New York. And after Fagan graduated and Becker left, they formed this songwriting and music writing duo. They didn't have much success in New York, so until they met this producer, Gary Katz, who got them a job at ABC Dunhill in California, and that's when they moved out there, and they tried to be professional songwriters for a while, which didn't work out because, of course, if you know anything about if you've ever heard Steely Dan's music, their lyrics are quite. That's something I enjoy about them, is their lyrics are often completely impenetrable. You have no idea what the song's about, and they require multiple listenings. Oftentimes, you have to consult with other people who know a lot about Steely Dan in order to get the true meaning behind the songs. And then sometimes you have to read books like this. For instance, the song "Chain Lightning," which is one of my favorite Steely Dan songs on the album Katie Lied. I guessed that it was about, and it's funny because they mentioned in this book, because it was a song that they intended to be completely impenetrable, to be so vague, so obscure that nobody could ever figure out what it was. They were the only ones who would know what it meant. Now, of course, they did disclose what it is. It's interesting. I knew that by the lyrics that it was supposed to convey. I thought it was a music star. It was the song begins where the speaker is describing the stadium or the venue that he and his friend are at. There's this guy there, and there are 100,000 people there. They say they're going to shake his hand. They're so excited to see him. It's chain lightning and feels so good. Turns out it's about a Nazi rally. So yeah, don't question the little man is a line in there, and the little man was Adolf Hitler. It's really funny to know that now, and I wouldn't have known it had it not been for this book. So if only for that, I'm glad I read it. But it's entertaining for the most part. I will say that music critics, like movie critics, have the tendency to have their heads planted firmly up their posterior cavities, as I'm fond of saying. Movie critics, I'll just say in passing, exhibit some of the most pretentious, ignorant, and pompous writing that you ever encounter. It's even worse than some literary critics because, again, most of them are relatively mediocre intellects, and that they think because they went to this fancy liberal arts college or to this film school that they are not part of the rabble, that they are part of this intellectual elite, and yet they don't actually have the intellectual substance to talk on the highest levels of culture and of literary analysis. And so they pretend to. They use a bunch of words that they hardly understand, and they pretend to know things when they don't. And so there are some examples in here that drove me absolutely nuts as a Steely Dan fan. For instance, they have reviews of each of the albums in here, and the guy who reviewed Katie Lied clearly had absolutely no idea what was going on. He said that Everyone's Gone to the Movies has utterly vacuous lyrics, which, if you know what Everyone's Gone to the Movies is about, it's far from vacuous. It's terribly disturbing. It's about a pervert, a child molester who invites little kids into his den and shows them pornographic movies. Now, what about that is vacuous and empty is beyond me. And the fact that the guy had absolutely no idea that you could even have that sort of interpretation of Everyone's Gone to the Movies shows that, again, his head is up his backside, and he loves to pretend that he knows what he's talking about when he has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. And I actually finished this book about an hour ago, just to let you guys in. There's another one in one of the last. There's another instance in one of the last articles in here where it was another example of somebody being a pretentious a-hole for no reason other than to be a pretentious a-hole. So this is a quote from a British article. It's a profile about Donald Fagen, who's one of the two. He was one of the two founding members of Steely Dan and one of the two consistent members. The thing about Steely Dan is they're not actually a band in the traditional sense of the word. It's the brainchild of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. They wrote the lyrics together, as I found out from this book. Fagen would sketch out the general would typically sketch out the general theme of whatever the song was, and maybe write out some lyrics, and then Becker would come in and color them, insert all the obscure references and the sarcastic, ironic humor that the Dan fans like me so dearly love, and so Donald Fagen and Walter Becker have been the only consistent members of Steely Dan throughout all their albums. I did come to know more about some of the people who were early on. For instance, Denny Diaz is probably the third most consistent member. He was their guitarist. He was on all their albums from Can't Buy a Thrill to, I think, The Royal Scam, or maybe I think he played on Aja actually. So he was a fairly consistent member. There's a funny story of how they met Denny Diaz. He had an ad in the Village Voice advertising himself. He said, "No jazz." He said, "Jazz chops." God, I want to get this right because it's so brilliant. And again, if you read this book, you're going to hear this story 10,000 times. So here we go. I found the section about Denny Diaz, but it doesn't have it. I know it's in here somewhere. Okay, I'm gonna have to look in the index because this. Trust me, it's going to be worth it. Excuse me. Maybe I should look under Village Voice. I apologize. I know this is terribly boring and unprofessional, but whatever. Here we go. All right. Dang it, I just mentioned. Oh, here we go. Bass and keyboard player with jazz chops. No assholes need apply. So that was pretty funny. I thought that was really funny. It's and another interesting fact. Jeff Skunk Baxter. Skunk was his nickname. Who plays some of the most impressive guitar solos on their early albums, especially on Countdown to Ecstasy, which is my favorite album, by the way. Very underappreciated album. Jeff Skunk Baxter later went on to become a specialist, an expert in missile defense technology, and he's testified before Congress on the issue. And so there's plenty of interesting information, and including some sad information. For instance, the fact that Jim Hodder, their first drummer, unfortunately died of a drowning in 1990, which I had no idea that he had passed away. So some very interesting insights into what is one of the most understated, for all their lyrical subversiveness, which they are. They're incredibly subversive, very ironic songwriters, and that's one of the things I love about them, because they're just as critical and acerbic about hippie culture, about the stupid brain dead counterculturalism of the '60s left. They make fun of them. They make fun of hippies a lot in their early work, especially the songs like "Reeling in the Years." One of the authors in here contends is essentially a picture of this sort of dewy-eyed, brain dead hippieism, counterculturalism, and songs. The most overt rejection of the hippie philosophy is in "Only a Fool Would Say That," which is one of my favorite songs. It's from their first album, "Can't Buy a Thrill." And but in their later works, of course, they criticize. They're not perfectly happy with capitalism or with and they definitely were on the left, politically. Although it's just refreshing, and that's one thing that's lacking on both sides, I would say, of the political spectrum. Although I would say more of the dogmatism is coming from the left nowadays. But the ability to stand aside from people generally from people who hold similar viewpoints to you, to be able to see the irony, to see the hilarious depravity of humanity in general, including people on your side, and to be able to see the underlying inadequacies and depravities of the underlying depravity and humor that runs through everything. I would say that irony is the natural response of of an idealist, of somebody who is an idealist, who's suddenly confronted with the terrible reality that things are not as they should be. That, say, in Aristotelian terms, that the telos for which human beings are supposed to, for the proper end of human life, of human activity, or the proper end of, say, marriage, that all these things, that the telos, the teleoi, I don't know how to conjugate Greek, are so fundamentally dramatically cast aside, are so neglected, are so utterly abandoned in modern society, that the only way that you can really maintain your sanity, if you still believe in those ideals, if you still believe in the purpose, if you still believe that it would be good, at least, if you could reach a level of cynicism where you can start to doubt that, but the only way that you can maintain your sanity, that you can avoid becoming Don Quixote, is by resorting to irony, by resorting to satire. And that, I think, is what you get from Steely Dan, and why it appeals so much to me, because I'd say I'm more of an idealist who's been confronted by the stark reality that people suck, and that the world sucks in general. But that's not a reason to sit around and mope and complain about other people, because sometimes you suck as much as they do. And so the way that you just have to move forward with that knowledge, and don't let yourself get bitten. But all right, so thank you for staying with us. I know that it's been trying, and I haven't done one of these in a while, so I apologize if I've been rambling and speaking relatively incoherently. I appreciate your staying with me, and happy birthday, or not happy birthday, Merry late Christmas, Nathan, and I hope you enjoyed your Christmas present. So here we go. We got, just to recap, we have Tyrant by Stephen Greenblatt, The Sense of Style by Steven Pinker, and Major Dudes, a Steely Dan Companion, which I would recommend if you're a Steely Dan fan. If you're not, I don't know that I would pick up this book in particular, because, again, you will be beaten over the head over and over again and have to read some pretty pretentious, god-awful writing. But I enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it, in spite of the pretentiousness of music critics. I've been told video game critics are even worse. So, but that's a topic for another day. If I can find a video game critique book to review, which I doubt I will. I doubt I'd have enough. I doubt I'd want to advertise that I'm reading such a book. Anyway, I never read I just realized I never read the excerpt from Major Dudes, which was an example of pretentious writing. So this is the end. This is one of the concluding articles. So the guy says, still, they weren't above sentimentality. There was always a kind of skeuomorphic feel about Steely Dan records, in that they imbued a certain kind of nostalgia, even though the songs themselves were incredibly modern. Now, if you're like me, you said to yourself, what the hell does skeuomorphic mean? So I tried to look it up. I found on Merriam-Webster that skeuomorphic is not really a word. Skeuomorph is a noun. And definition of skeuomorph is an ornament or design representing a utensil or implement. So given the context of that word and how it was used, that has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the sentence, and this guy is just trying to use a word that sounds highbrow but really doesn't have much meaning, and definitely does not have the meaning that he thinks it means, kind of to paraphrase Inigo Montoya from Princess Bride. So that's just, be warned if you pick up this book. You'll have to read a lot of insufferable music journalists. You'll have to deal with them. So I would recommend it for any Steely Dan fan, because, again, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much as a Steely Dan fan, and there's a lot to be learned from this book. But I have also, I hope, made you fully aware of its shortcomings. So thank you for joining me, and I won't take any more of your time away from you. So thank you.